This is Cars and Bids, and today I'm going to talk about trends that I see will be picking up or continuing in 2021. We've just finished 2020, we've got a lot of data, a lot of car sales, so what do I think is going to be the stuff to look for in terms of the car market in 2021? What's going to be hot? What's going to sell for more money? What are people going to be excited about next year? Let's check it out. Okay, now I want to start by saying this is a little difficult to predict. Trends. What is going to be hot? What are people going to be into? In part, I've kind of looked at what people have already been into and sort of extrapolated some of the stuff that will continue in the future. But I've isolated 5 trends that I think will continue or pick up dramatically next year and in the coming years in terms of the car market and the car world. So here are my 5 picks for trends that cars are going to become more valuable that fall into these categories over the next year or more. Number 1 is off-road and lifted SUVs and trucks. I have made this point a million times on this channel. I'm sorry to harp on it so many times if you watched all these videos, but off-roader SUVs have done unbelievably well on Cars and Bids. Land Cruisers, Jeeps, Defenders, G-Wagons. We've sold a bunch of great G-Wagons for good money. They can't come in fast enough. We sell almost all off-roader vehicles. We've had some very special ones. We had a manual Cayenne that had off-roader tires. We had a lifted BMW X5 with a manual transmission. Two-door G-Wagon coupes, as I call them. We've sold 3 of those, I think, and they've all done really well and exceeded the seller's expectations. Off-roader SUVs are hot, I think in part because of COVID. I think people are trying to get away and they can't really fly or travel in the traditional sense, so people are buying kind of vehicles that allow them to, go maybe camping or off-roading somewhere isolated, somewhere where there's no risk. And I think also, it's just gas is relatively cheap. People want cool cars that they can use with their whole family, not just sports cars. And off-roader SUVs have really just taken off. So Jeeps, Wagoneers, any of these cars, they've already been on the upswing, but they're going to continue to be. If you have a good off-roader SUV and you're looking to sell it, Cars and Bids has great results, and I think we will continue to. Okay, next up, number 2 trend that I see for the car market in 2021. This one is a little bit more out on a limb, and that is clean examples of cars that got cheap, I think are going to continue to sell for more and more money, especially 80s and 90s cars. There's been a time where a lot of normal 80s and 90s cars were just cheap kind of cars. And now that we're in 2020-21, cars that have been preserved from that era, even boring ones, Honda Accords, Ford Explorers, are starting to bring real money. We had an Acura Vigor sell for 12 grand, something like that. A Mitsubishi Eclipse sold for 13. And its only real claim to fame, both these cars, was they were unmodified. They were low mileage. They were nice. They didn't have crazy stuff. They weren't the last Eclipse ever built. We recently sold a 91 Ford Explorer for what I thought was big money. That wasn't the first or the last Explorer. It was just a really nice Explorer, and these are getting harder to find. One great example of this, we sold a Lexus SC400, I think it was a 99, yes, for $24,000. This is an unthinkable number just a few years ago, but this car had 13,000 miles and it was basically pristine and new. And I know the seller and the buyer were happy with that number. They should be. This is a special car, and I think cars like this are only going to get more valuable. Now, whenever we post a sale result of a car like this and it's high, like the FJ Cruiser we sold for $50,000, people are just like, that's too much money to spend for a car like that. That's crazy. Why would someone do that? Well, this must have been how people thought when 50 Chevys started selling for big money, when split windows became $200,000 cars in '08. Back when stuff was really insane, people look back and say, I can't believe people are paying that money. Well, the market dictates what stuff is worth, and more car people are starting to gravitate towards really nice examples of 80s and 90s cars, just as they gravitated towards nice examples of 50s and 60s cars as people who grew up in that era started to be able to afford them. And so it's very clear to me that this is a trend that will only continue to grow. Low mileage, nicely kept examples of 80s and 90s cars, even mundane ones like Hondas, will continue to become more and more valuable. People have nostalgia. And if you can pick up a nice SC400 for only $24,000, think about what a 911 from that era costs. A 993 is like 70. But here's an example, maybe your uncle had one of these or something and you want to just live that experience. Finding nice ones is hard, so when you do, you pay up. And I'm not at all surprised that cars like this are bringing big money, and I think that's only going to continue. Okay, next up, next trend that I see really picking up over the next few years is pickup trucks. Now, I'm a little behind the curve on this because pickup trucks have picked up over the last few years, and specifically 50s and 60s trucks in nice shape have become really desirable and valuable. But I'm going to extend this to 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s pickup trucks as well. I think that really clean 80s and 90s trucks are going to start bringing really big money for the same reason that I just said, that the really clean examples of sort of normal cars that got cheap also bring money. It's really hard to find. People use trucks as workhorses, and when so they're beat up. They're often used and abused and then discarded. When some survive, again, people are nostalgic. They want to go back to that square body Chevy, or they want to go back to that F-250 with the ridiculous dog dish hubcap covering the lug nuts. People like that stuff. And I'm not at all surprised that trucks are starting to get more valuable. So it's no longer just 50s, 60s trucks. We're trying to run more and more auctions of 80s trucks that are in nice shape, relatively low miles, or rare ones, dualies or crew cabs. Watch for trucks to become more and more valuable, larger, full-size 80s, 90s trucks. I think that really is a place that the market is going to expand if you can find them in nice shape. Okay, next up, another trend that is going to be big in 2021. This trend has already kind of started to grow, but I think it's going to explode, and that would be colors. Colors has become an interesting thing. Over the last 10 years, Porsche enthusiasts have started to pursue cool colored examples of older cars. Because the thing about Porsches is, especially 911s from like the 90s and 80s, they're not rare. You see them all over the place. They're not hard to find. However, Porsche enthusiasts, they want to have something that's a little bit more distinct from a regular 911 that you see every day. And so they've been paying big money for colors, paint to sample cars. There was a time when they were worth the same as regular colored cars, or less if it was a weird color. Well, now those weird colors have skyrocketed. So the Porsche market led this, but it's trickled down into other cars too. And I've noticed that cars that were built by the factory in weird, special, interesting, paint to sample-y type colors are bringing big money. We had a great example on the site the other day, this E36 M3 in this brown color that they called Byzance metallic. It had a big result, 16,750, which was a big number for a sedan with the mileage that it had. And I think people are just, if they can afford it, they don't want just a white one or a silver one or a blue one anymore. They want Byzance metallic or whatever. And we see this with everything. Audi exclusive colors, Porsche. We had a good example, a 2012 E63 AMG station wagon that was in Cupright brown. So it's a brown AMG wagon, rare color, maybe the only one, sold for $48,000 as a 2012, $46,000. Which is big money. I sold my 2012 for $35,000. Someone clearly paid up for a one-of-one color. Very special car. But I think that colors are going to become a real breakout. If you can find cars that were painted by the factory in weird and special colors, that's going to be something that people continue to gravitate towards, and probably even more so in 2021. Having a special car isn't enough anymore. There's a lot of E63 wagons at Cars and Coffee. You want to show up with one that is Cupright brown. And finally, the last trend that I think will continue in 2021 is cars I think will become more valuable that are at the sweet spot of analog and good. Which, let me explain what I mean. So there was a time when cars were analog, but also slow and not very modern seeming. The 80s and 90s cars are largely like that. They're great cars, a lot of great cars from that era, but by modern standards, they're not really that fast. They don't perform incredibly well. They maybe don't handle quite as well as a modern car. They're not as fast. They're not up to modern performance standards. Meanwhile, modern cars are very high performing and excellent and fast and sporty in terms of sports cars, obviously, but they're not very analog. And a lot of car enthusiasts, especially cars and bids enthusiasts, are looking for more analog cars. But there was a sweet spot where cars were both analog and have modern performance. And that was, to me, the early to mid 2000s. So you're looking at the E39 M5, the Honda S2000, the Toyota Land Cruiser 100, honestly, was a great combination of that because it was relatively analog and simple as SUV off-roaders go now, but it was also luxurious enough that you could drive around. It wasn't modern performance in terms of speed, but it was modern performance in terms of drivability. These cars from this era, I think, will be revered long term as the great combination of performance and relative modernity. The S2000 feels a lot more modern inside than, for example, a 300ZX from the 90s, and the performance is a lot better. I mean, they're great cars to drive. And this was true of a lot of cars from this era. And it's not just, cars that are relatively affordable. Exotics from this era too. I think the Ford GT, the Porsche Carrera GT, cars from this area will really start to rise. It was sort of the last gasp of analog, and yet performance had advanced to the point where these cars were still exciting and drivable and enjoyable. So my view is that sweet spot, cars from the early mid-2000s that have a good combination of old school analog and performance, those cars are going to continue to be revered and sought after. And I don't think some of those cars will really ever go down in value. But those are the 5 trends that I think will continue or blow up in 2021 and beyond. That's the stuff that I expect will do really well on cars and bids as we go into the future. And that's that. Those are my thoughts anyway. Let's see what actually happens next year and beyond.